A sharp, metallic whine from the microphone pierced the room before my mother delivered the punchline of my life. Crystal chandeliers bled warm light over polished marble, illuminating 100 of the city's elite inside my sister Marjorie's flagship salon. Cameras fired like strobe lights. Champagne flowed in rivers of gold. My mother stood center stage, radiant, a crystal flute in one hand and the mic in the other. "We are so blessed to have a daughter who actually built an empire," she purred, blowing a kiss to Marjorie. The room erupted in applause. Then her gaze snapped to the back wall, to me. And then, "There's my other daughter. No ambition, no stability, just a quiet little burden we've graciously carried." Laughter rolled through the gallery. It wasn't a cruel, jagged sound. It was soft, casual, and suffocatingly comfortable, the laughter of people looking at a stray dog. I didn't flinch. I took a slow sip of my water, set the glass on a silver tray, and smiled. Let them laugh. They thought I owned nothing. They didn't realize I owned the ground they were standing on. Marjorie held court like a queen, absorbing the adoration of bankers and boutique owners. The salon was a monument to her ego, muted blush velvet, cascading glass petals, gold-framed mirrors whispering luxury. My mother hovered behind her, curating introductions. Visionary, unstoppable. I remained a ghost in the corner. This was the narrative they had weaponized since my father's funeral. Whenever I asked about the trust he left me, I was labeled overwhelmed and sensitive. My silence was branded as incompetence. It was an efficient fairy tale. Marjorie, the golden child born to conquer. Me, the fragile scapegoat born to consume. But as the applause echoed off the marble, I felt no anger. Only the icy, intoxicating clarity of an executioner. Because the truth was a loaded gun they didn't know was pointed at their heads. For 3 years, my shadow corporation had been the exclusive supplier for Pembroke Beauty Group. Every diamond-studded clasp, every limited edition bracelet beneath those gold mirrors was sourced, distributed, and legally bound by contracts my legal team drafted. Marjorie's curated empire wasn't built on her genius. It was built on my hidden infrastructure. My name wasn't on the walls. It was on the lease, the supplier agreements, the very lifeblood of her inventory. As investors clinked glasses, toasting to million-dollar expansion rounds, Marjorie publicly thanked our mother for the seed capital. I almost laughed. Did they really believe that money materialized from thin air? "Family photo!" someone shouted. My mother waved me over with the careless flick of a wrist. I stepped into the frame, matching their plastic smiles. The flash froze the perfect lie. A dynasty united. No one could see the fracture running beneath it. I slipped out before the dessert trays arrived. The valet brought my car as their laughter spilled into the cool night air. I didn't replay the humiliation as I drove away. I replayed my attorney's voice from this morning, confirming the audit report and the termination clauses. They had just introduced me to their elite world as a helpless burden. Tomorrow morning, when the legal notices hit their desks, they would wake up to realize the burden they mocked had just severed the lifeline to their entire empire. The trust was supposed to protect me. That was what everyone said the day my father's will was read aloud in the attorney's office. I was 24, still wearing black from the funeral, still trying to process the silence he left behind. The documents were thick, formal, precise. A portion of his estate had been placed into a protected trust in my name, structured to preserve long-term financial security until I reached full control at 35. My mother was appointed trustee. At the time, it sounded responsible, stable, safe. For the first year, I didn't question anything. My mother reassured me that the funds were being invested conservatively. She spoke about market timing and portfolio diversification as if she had always managed complex financial instruments. Whenever I asked about projected distributions, she would smile gently and tell me not to worry. "It's better if we let it grow," she'd say. "You don't want to make decisions too quickly." I wanted to believe her. Grief makes you cling to the illusion of unity. Around that same time, Marjorie announced she was launching her first boutique salon. The seed capital appeared quickly. A prime retail lease was secured. Renovations began within weeks. Investors praised her ambition. My mother stood beside her at every meeting, describing the venture as a bold, family-supported initiative. I remember noticing how smoothly the funding materialized. I remember wondering why discussions about my trust had suddenly become more abstract. When I asked again about a modest distribution to explore graduate courses, I was told it wasn't advisable. "You're still figuring things out," my mother said. "Let's not complicate your life with financial pressure." The language around me shifted slowly but deliberately. In family gatherings, I was described as sensitive. At business dinners, I was introduced as someone still searching for direction. It wasn't overt cruelty. It was suggestion, repetition, concern packaged as protection. When I pushed for detailed trust statements, my mother began referencing my emotional state. She suggested therapy. She implied I was overwhelmed by numbers I didn't fully understand. The implication was subtle but effective. I lacked the capacity to manage what was mine. 2 years after my father's death, Marjorie opened her second location. The expansion required additional capital. Again, funding appeared without visible strain. I requested a formal meeting to review trust performance in detail. My mother arrived with organized folders and summarized growth in vague percentages without providing underlying allocation breakdowns. When I pressed for documentation, she sighed and said, "Adriana, this is exactly why we're protecting you. You get anxious about things you don't fully grasp." Marjorie added that entrepreneurship had required enormous stress, and how grateful she was that our mother understood complex financial strategy. The contrast was clear. One daughter was capable, the other was not. The first real alarm came when a distant cousin mentioned, casually, how impressed he was that my trust money had helped launch something so successful. I felt the air thin around me. I asked what he meant. He backtracked immediately, claiming he must have misunderstood. That was the moment I began requesting independent legal advice, quietly, without informing my family. An external attorney reviewed the limited documentation I possessed. He noted inconsistencies between projected trust growth and actual market averages. He explained fiduciary duty in careful terms. A trustee must act in the sole best interest of the beneficiary. Any redirection of funds for external ventures required explicit protective measures. When he asked whether I had signed off on any such reallocations, I realized I had signed nothing. I had approved nothing. I had only been reassured. By the time Marjorie expanded into a third location, my access to meaningful information had narrowed further. Statements were delayed, meetings were postponed. I was encouraged to focus on stability instead of questioning structure. Publicly, my reputation as the unreliable daughter solidified. Privately, I began educating myself about estate law, investment allocation, and corporate structuring. If they believed I didn't understand financial systems, I would learn them thoroughly. They thought controlling the trust meant controlling me. They believed framing me as unstable would neutralize my credibility. What they didn't understand was that every dismissal forced me to sharpen my awareness. Every suggestion that I was incapable pushed me to examine documents more closely. I stopped asking for validation. I started gathering evidence. The final denial came in the form of a letter. It was printed on heavy paper with neutral legal language, explaining that any request for discretionary distribution from the trust would be postponed due to protective oversight considerations. There was no argument left to make, no meeting left to schedule. The decision had already been made without me. I folded the letter once, placed it back in the envelope, and understood that waiting for fairness was no longer an option. I left 3 weeks later. I withdrew the remaining balance from my personal account, packed a suitcase, and relocated to Portland because it was far enough from my family's social circle to be irrelevant. I did not announce my departure publicly. My mother framed it as me needing space. Marjorie told acquaintances I was focusing on personal growth. Neither of them asked how I would support myself. They assumed I would return eventually. The job at Calder & Sons Jewelry was not glamorous, but it was available. The storefront sat between a bakery and a hardware shop on a narrow street that smelled faintly of roasted coffee and metal polish. I started at the lowest level, cleaning display cases, logging inventory, learning how to weigh gold down to decimal precision. I memorized carat conversions. I practiced distinguishing natural stones from treated ones under a loupe. No one trained me formally beyond the basics. I trained myself. Mr. Calder, the owner, was direct and unsentimental. He did not inquire about my past. He cared only about accuracy. The first time I recalculated a supplier invoice and identified a pricing discrepancy before payment cleared, he paused longer than usual before nodding. "You pay attention," he said. That was the closest thing to praise I received for months. I began staying late after closing hours, reviewing purchasing records and shipment histories. I studied how inventory turnover affected liquidity. I tracked seasonal buying patterns. I compared supplier consistency across quarters. What fascinated me was not the jewelry itself, but the movement of capital behind it. Every necklace displayed in velvet trays represented weight, cost, margin, and timing. I built spreadsheets on my laptop, modeling profit ratios under different purchasing scenarios. Numbers felt cleaner than conversation. They did not distort intention. 6 months into the job, a supplier attempted to deliver mixed-grade gold under uniform billing rates. The paperwork looked correct at first glance, but the weight distribution within the batch felt uneven. I requested random purity tests before authorizing payment. The results confirmed my suspicion. The discrepancy would have cost the store thousands. Mr. Calder renegotiated the contract immediately and gave me partial oversight over procurement after that incident. Trust, I learned, was incremental and earned through precision. Outside of work, I lived carefully. I rented a small studio apartment with thin walls and unreliable heating. I cooked inexpensive meals and saved aggressively. I calculated how long it would take to accumulate enough capital to open something of my own. I did not aim for expansion. I aimed for control. My independence would not depend on applause or investor enthusiasm. It would depend on margins and discipline. After 2 years, I partnered with a former wholesaler who had left his distribution firm due to internal disputes. We combined my operational analysis with his sourcing network and opened a modest retail shop. We did not overspend on decor. We did not sign long-term leases beyond necessity. Every contract we signed was reviewed carefully. Every clause was understood fully. I refused to build anything dependent on verbal assurances. The first year was steady but modest. We reinvested profits instead of expanding prematurely. By the second year, we had sufficient cash flow to open a second location. I structured the business under a holding company name that did not include mine. Anonymity was intentional. My family monitored public success closely. I preferred invisibility. While Marjorie continued expanding salons funded by capital I suspected had once been mine, I was building something entirely separate. She operated through visibility and praise. I operated through infrastructure and data. They believed I lacked the capacity to understand financial systems. In reality, I was mastering them in silence. By the time our third location opened, I no longer felt like someone starting from nothing. I felt like someone constructing something no one could take away without consequence. By the fourth year, the retail storefront was no longer the center of our operation. The real value had shifted behind the scenes. We consolidated our 3 locations under a centralized holding structure and expanded into small-scale manufacturing. Instead of purchasing finished pieces from distributors, we began designing limited collections and controlling production directly. The margins widened immediately. So did our leverage. We registered the new structure under a neutral corporate name that revealed nothing about ownership. My partner handled most external appearances. Legal counsel represented us in high-level negotiations. I stayed out of press interviews and industry panels. There were no profile features, no public biographies, no celebratory posts. Silence was strategic. It kept scrutiny low and flexibility high. The shift toward supplying boutique businesses came almost accidentally. Several local salons began experimenting with luxury retail corners, integrating jewelry and curated accessories into their beauty spaces. They needed consistent quality and predictable delivery cycles. Most suppliers operated on bulk models with rigid minimums. We offered something different: flexible rotation programs, limited inventory risk, and strict quality control. Within 18 months, our supply division outperformed retail entirely. That was when Pembroke Beauty Group entered the pipeline. My operations manager flagged the inquiry without realizing the connection. The chain had expanded to 5 locations and was seeking an exclusive jewelry partner for all current and future salons. I reviewed the preliminary data personally. The projected volume was significant. The payment terms were solid. The geographic overlap was minimal. The irony did not escape me. I approved the proposal process without disclosing my personal connection to anyone beyond legal counsel. All negotiations flowed through our commercial director. The contract required strict compliance metrics, fixed delivery schedules, and performance reviews tied to renewal eligibility. There were no sentimental clauses, no handshake assurances, only documented obligations. When Pembroke Beauty Group signed the agreement, they announced it proudly. My mother praised the strategic upgrade in supplier quality. Marjorie called it proof of disciplined expansion. For the next 3 years, our infrastructure became embedded in their growth. 60% of their accessory revenue relied on our production cycles. Seasonal launches aligned with our design calendar. Investors cited supply stability as a core strength during funding discussions. At family gatherings, I listened as my mother described Marjorie's operational brilliance. She never mentioned the unseen logistics supporting it. She never questioned who engineered those systems. Meanwhile, I intensified the independent review of my trust documentation. With the help of external counsel, I analyzed transaction histories dating back to the first year after my father's death. Certain reallocations stood out. Funds earmarked for conservative growth had been redirected through layered transfers into early-stage salon development expenses. The structure was technical but traceable. The pattern was consistent. It was not an accident. I did not confront them. I adjusted my own structure instead. I strengthened termination clauses in the supplier contract, ensuring clear exit rights under strategic discretion. I diversified our client portfolio so that losing any single account, even Pembroke Beauty Group, would not destabilize us. I refused to mirror their dependency. If they relied on my infrastructure, I would ensure I did not rely on their revenue. As Marjorie prepared for her flagship grand opening in the downtown district, investor enthusiasm intensified. Expansion plans extended into neighboring states. Public messaging framed the company as unstoppable. What none of them realized was that the foundation beneath their expansion was not theirs to control. They assumed supply stability was permanent. They assumed contracts were formalities. They assumed I was still the daughter who struggled with numbers. They celebrated growth built on systems they did not understand. I watched quietly as projections climbed and applause followed. They believed they had constructed an empire through vision and confidence. In reality, that empire rested on infrastructure I designed, contracts I structured, and distribution networks I controlled. And I had yet to attach my name to any of it. The report arrived on a Tuesday morning, bound in a thin gray folder that looked deceptively ordinary. My attorney slid it across the conference table and said nothing at first. I opened it slowly, scanning the summary page before moving to the detailed analysis. The language was careful but precise. Trust allocations originally structured for long-term beneficiary preservation had been redirected through internal transfers into entities directly connected to Marjorie's early salon expansions. There were no signed beneficiary approvals, no protective addendums, no documentation that demonstrated the redirection had been made solely in my best interest. My mother had always framed those years as strategic family support. The documents framed them differently. As trustee, she had a fiduciary duty to act exclusively for the beneficiary. Any deviation required explicit safeguards. Instead, layered transfers moved funds into operating accounts that later financed lease deposits, renovation contracts, and marketing campaigns for Pembroke Beauty Group. The pattern was not isolated. It repeated across multiple fiscal quarters. At the same time, my commercial director forwarded the contract renewal proposal from Pembroke Beauty Group. The subject line read simply, 5-year extension. The expansion momentum had accelerated. They were preparing to enter 2 additional cities. Investors were scheduled to attend the flagship unveiling. Their valuation projections assumed uninterrupted supplier continuity. Our company's infrastructure was embedded in those projections. I asked my legal team to examine both timelines side by side. The trust irregularities and the contract renewal window converged within the same quarter. If I signed the extension quietly, nothing would change. The The salons would continue expanding. The trust findings would remain internal. The narrative about my instability would persist. If I terminated strategically, the dependency would surface before new capital commitments finalized. The decision required precision, not emotion. I attended one investor preview dinner at my mother's invitation. The event was curated and polished, designed to signal confidence. Marjorie presented revenue growth charts with rehearsed ease. My mother spoke about disciplined oversight and long-term sustainability. Investors nodded approvingly. No one asked who structured the supply chain metrics supporting those projections. I observed quietly, noting how casually my reputation had been minimized to elevate theirs. The following week, my attorney confirmed that our supplier agreement included a 30-day termination clause under strategic portfolio restructuring. There were no penalties attached. There were no automatic renewal provisions. The language had been drafted by my team 3 years earlier with deliberate clarity. We also prepared a formal fiduciary review summary addressed to my mother in her capacity as trustee. The document outlined allocation deviations without public accusation. It stated facts, referenced obligations, and preserved legal positioning. I did not want spectacle. I wanted leverage without theatrics. I instructed my team to prepare 2 sealed envelopes. The first contained the formal contract termination notice. The second contained the fiduciary review summary. Both would be delivered to their executive office on the same morning. Timing mattered. If the termination notice arrived without context, they would assume negotiation. If the fiduciary summary arrived alone, they would assume private settlement. Together, they formed a message. The morning I signed the termination notice, the office was quiet. I reviewed the language carefully before adding my signature. Strategic repositioning of supplier alignment. 30 days notice effective immediately. Professional, clean. I signed the fiduciary summary minutes later. The courier confirmations arrived by noon. Patricia, their executive assistant, had signed for both packages. Within hours, my phone lit up with missed calls. My mother's number appeared repeatedly. Marjorie's followed. I did not answer. I allowed the documents to speak first. They had spent years controlling the story about me through repetition and suggestion. This time, the narrative would move through contracts and compliance. I knew what the termination meant for them. 60% of their accessory revenue would destabilize within weeks. Investors would demand clarification. Replacement suppliers would require time they did not have. I had no intention of humiliating them publicly. I had every intention of protecting what was mine. For years, they believed I lacked the capacity to understand financial systems. Now, the systems themselves were responding. The countdown had begun, and this time, I was the one controlling the timeline. The flagship expansion meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the river. Investors, senior managers, and legal advisors filled the long table with laptops open and presentation decks queued. Marjorie stood confidently at the head, her posture composed, her tone polished. She moved through projected growth charts with rehearsed certainty, outlining new lease acquisitions and projected revenue increases tied to multi-city expansion. My mother sat beside her, reinforcing the narrative of disciplined oversight and strategic family leadership. I was listed on the agenda as a supply chain representative. No one in that room expected more than a routine update confirming delivery continuity. My commercial director introduced the segment and referenced our company's long-standing partnership with Pembroke Beauty Group. The lead investor leaned forward and asked a direct question about long-term supplier guarantees. The room shifted subtly. Expansion funding depended on that answer. The door at the side of the conference room opened, and I walked in without urgency. Conversations paused. Marjorie's expression tightened as she recognized me. My mother's composure faltered for a fraction of a second before resetting. I took a seat near the center of the table, placed a slim folder in front of me, and introduced myself formally as the sole owner and managing director of the holding company supplying their jewelry infrastructure. The silence that followed was heavy but contained. I outlined the termination notice delivered 2 weeks earlier, 30 days notice under strategic portfolio restructuring, no breach, no hostility, a contractual exit. My legal counsel, seated to my right, confirmed compliance with all termination provisions and clarified that no automatic extension applied without mutual agreement. The lead investor requested clarification on operational impact. I responded with numbers, not emotion. 60% of accessory revenue tied directly to our production cycles. Replacement suppliers would require extended onboarding. Inventory gaps were inevitable. Marjorie attempted to frame the situation as renegotiation leverage. I corrected her calmly. The decision had already been executed within contract rights. There would be no renegotiation. My mother interjected, calling the matter a misunderstanding that could be resolved privately. My attorney then introduced the fiduciary review summary. The document outlined irregular trust allocations in neutral language, referencing trustee obligations without theatrical accusation. The temperature in the room changed. Investors who had been evaluating expansion potential now shifted toward risk mitigation. Questions surfaced about governance transparency. Had estate funds been redirected into early business capitalization? Were those transfers documented under beneficiary consent? My mother attempted to classify it as a family matter. The lead investor disagreed. Governance concerns intersect directly with executive credibility. I did not mention the grand opening speech. I did not reference public humiliation. I stated one sentence clearly. This is not personal. It is structural. The infrastructure supporting your expansion is no longer aligned with your growth plan. The truth was simpler than revenge. Dependency without oversight creates vulnerability. The meeting, originally scheduled for 90 minutes, extended into 3 hours of compliance discussion. Expansion approval was postponed pending independent audit review. Investors requested forensic analysis before releasing additional capital. Marjorie's presentation slides remained frozen on the screen behind her, growth projections suspended mid-chart. When the discussion concluded, I gathered my folder and stood. My mother's voice, now stripped of polish, asked whether this was necessary. I answered without raising my tone. It became necessary the moment control replaced consent. The room remained silent. No one laughed. No one applauded. I exited through the same door I had entered. Behind me, conversations resumed, but they were no longer celebratory. They were strategic and defensive. For years, they had shaped the story about my instability. In that room, the narrative shifted without spectacle. Contracts replaced commentary. Documentation replaced rumor. They had built an empire assuming I would never sit at their table. They had assumed I lacked the competence to understand their systems. Instead, I had structured the very system they depended on. And in a single meeting, I removed myself from it, leaving them to confront the consequences of decisions they believed would never be questioned. The fallout did not explode in public headlines. It unfolded in controlled tremors that weakened their foundation day by day. Within 48 hours of the boardroom meeting, Pembroke Beauty Group's legal team contacted 3 alternative suppliers. None could match our production volume without significant delays. Lead times extended from 4 weeks to 12. Cost projections increased. Inventory forecasts were revised downward. Investors requested updated risk assessments before releasing pending capital. My mother called repeatedly the first week. I allowed the calls to go unanswered. When a formal letter arrived questioning the legality of our termination, my attorney responded within hours. The reply cited the exact clause authorizing strategic withdrawal, referenced documented notice compliance, and rejected any claim of breach. There was no ambiguity left to argue. Contract law does not bend under disappointment. Simultaneously, the fiduciary review summary began circulating among senior advisory members. It had not been filed in court yet, but its existence shifted internal dynamics. Investors who once praised disciplined oversight now requested documentation of trust allocation processes. The language changed from admiration to inquiry. Governance transparency became a recurring phrase in executive meetings. The expansion narrative stalled under compliance review. Marjorie attempted to maintain composure publicly. She released statements describing a strategic supplier transition aligned with growth optimization. Inside the company, however, operational strain became visible. Boutique managers reported inconsistent restocking cycles. Seasonal launches were delayed. Promotional campaigns built around curated jewelry collections were scaled back. Revenue from accessory divisions dipped noticeably within a single quarter. 2 months after termination notice, a primary investor formally requested a third-party forensic audit before committing to the next funding round. The board approved it reluctantly. Forensic accounting does not operate quietly. It reconstructs transaction pathways with precision. Estate transfers, early capital injections, layered financial routing. Patterns become visible when examined systematically. Family communication shifted tone. Distant relatives who once repeated the narrative about my instability began calling with cautious curiosity. They asked whether the situation was misunderstood. I offered no detailed explanation. I repeated the same line consistently. My company acted within contractual rights. The trust review is under legal consideration. I refused to discuss anything beyond documented fact. One afternoon, my mother appeared at my office without appointment. She asked for a private conversation. I agreed, with counsel present. Her composure was intact but thinner than before. She spoke about legacy, about family unity, about reputational damage. She suggested compromise. I listened without interruption. When she finished, I asked a single question. When did you plan to disclose the trust reallocations to me voluntarily? She did not answer directly. She referenced complexity. She referenced timing. She referenced intention. None of those words altered documentation. Silence followed. The distance between us felt larger than any courtroom. Within 6 months, Pembroke Beauty Group announced a strategic pause in expansion. Official statements cited market volatility. Internally, funding delays and operational instability told a clearer story. Layoffs were limited but symbolic. Confidence in leadership weakened. Marjorie's once celebrated projections were replaced by recovery plans. I did not release public statements. I did not pursue media exposure. The power shift did not require spectacle. It required patience. The same systems that had been used to marginalize me were now subject to scrutiny. For years, they assumed I would either remain silent or react emotionally. Instead, I relied on documentation and timing. The humiliation at the grand opening had been theatrical. The response was structural. They had controlled the narrative through repetition. I controlled it through evidence. By the time the audit process advanced toward formal findings, the story no longer belonged to them. It belonged to contracts, compliance, and fiduciary obligation. And those systems are indifferent to family hierarchy. 6 months after the board released the audit summary, the language was final and irreversible. The report confirmed that trust funds designated for long-term beneficiary protection had been redirected into early business capital allocations without documented consent safeguards. It did not use dramatic words. It did not accuse with emotion. It described negligence, structural deviation, and fiduciary breach exposure. Investors responded accordingly. Pending expansion rounds were withdrawn. Strategic growth plans were indefinitely suspended. My mother stepped down as trustee under legal advisement, and the trust was transferred to independent third-party oversight. The mechanism designed to control me had collapsed under documentation. Settlement discussions were proposed within weeks. The language was careful: restoration, rebalancing, family resolution. I declined any arrangement that required informal reconciliation in exchange for silence. The only terms I accepted were structural. The trust was formally restructured with judicial safeguards. All prior allocations were reviewed, and compensatory adjustments were executed under court supervision. There were no celebratory announcements, only signatures and compliance. Marjorie sent a message late one evening. It was brief, almost clinical. She claimed she had never fully understood the source of early capital transfers. She insisted she trusted our mother's guidance. Perhaps she did. Perhaps it was easier not to question favorable outcomes. I did not respond. Not every explanation requires engagement. Some require distance. Professionally, my company stabilized quickly. Diversification strategies we implemented years earlier absorbed the temporary revenue loss from terminating their contract. Boutique partnerships expanded in new regions. Our governance structure, once invisible, became a quiet selling point. Investors appreciated documentation discipline. Compliance had value. My name remained absent from marketing materials, but within industry circles, our holding company was referenced as an example of strategic resilience during operational turbulence. One evening, I drove past the flagship salon after closing hours. The lights were dimmed. The windows reflected the street instead of applause. I remembered the night my mother had introduced me as a burden. The laughter had been loud then, confident, certain. Standing across the street now, I felt none of that humiliation, only clarity. They believed ownership was visibility. They believed authority was narrative control. They never considered that ownership could exist quietly behind contracts and infrastructure. I never demanded an apology. I never asked for acknowledgement in front of witnesses. My power did not require their validation. It required boundaries. Walking away from the boardroom that day was not revenge. It was alignment. I protected what was mine. I allowed systems to function as designed. I refused to let public humiliation dictate private worth. There is a difference between reacting and restructuring. For years, they framed me as unstable to justify withholding control. They assumed silence meant incapacity. In reality, silence was preparation. Contracts replaced confrontation. Evidence replaced argument. Timing replaced anger. By the time they realized the shift, it was already documented. If you have ever been labeled incapable by people who benefited from underestimating you, you understand the weight of quiet preparation. Sometimes the most powerful response is not loud. It is precise. It is patient. It is strategic. And sometimes the only way to reclaim control is to step back and let structure speak for you. If this story resonates with you, I would genuinely like to know your perspective. Have you ever had to draw a boundary with family to protect your future? Did you choose confrontation, or did you choose strategy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Conversations like this help others realize they are not alone in navigating complicated family dynamics. If you value stories about hidden power, financial clarity, and standing firm without theatrics, stay with this channel. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. Every subscription helps this space grow, and every shared experience strengthens someone who might still be standing in a room where everyone else is laughing. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.